I don't think I've got any announcements I'm supposed to make. In fact, I can't think of anything interesting, erudite or witty to say, so I'm going to pass you over to Richard. Except, he's not Richard, he's Barry Tadcaster.
James Newton creeps about at night for nefarious purposes, including but not limited to the creation of counterfeit Ryvita, onion laundering, and asking favours from tree surgeons, if you know what I mean, right? Yes, favours from tree surgeons. He, for the past 20 years, he has been collecting Alan Bleasdale's breath in jars, and he's going to show us his collection today.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Yeah, I became interested in the whole area of Bigfoot from a very small child. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail. Today I want to talk about how I feel that Bigfootology, if you want to call it, has changed over the years. And to see where we are now, what I want you to do is put in a little bit of historical context of where we come from in this subject matter, to see where we actually are. I am fully confirmed and unashamed armchair cryptozoologist. I have no interest in doing field research at all, but love the fact that Richard Freeman and other people are out there doing stuff and write books that I can read from my armchair. But anyway, so it gives you that context. I'm no expert other than what I've read on books or online. So yeah, the current developments in Bigfoot research, so it's a presentation and discussion exploring new trends in Bigfoot studies, habituation scenarios and the very nature of research. So to give us a beginning, the modern era of Bigfoot can be more or less explained from Jerry Crew and the birth of Bigfoot. Jerry Crew was a bulldozer operator in Northern California. In 1958, he was working in a remote location with some other people and found, at weekends they would go back home to their families. They would come back to the site they were working and would find big footprints all over there, the site where they were working. Stuff would be thrown around that human beings couldn't move on their own without equipment. And eventually he took one of these, we found a good cast, took a picture of it, and through various ways it became more mainstream, people found out about it. And that was it. And that was when, so it was 1958 when I suppose the Bigfoot hit the mainstream. Over a period of time, this was like when they became known as the Four Horsemen of Sasquatchery from about 1958. Most of them, through these investigators, came what became known as the classics of Bigfoot study. So there was like the Albert Ostman kidnapped situation, the Ape Canyon attacks, and the situation of the Chapman family. But these four guys up here became known as the Four Horsemen of Sasquatchery. The top right, René de Hinden, was a Swiss immigrant to Canada. Again, he was working, I think, out in the mountains or something. And he, through talking to people, he became hooked on the subject matter. John Green, also Canadian, was a journalist. Began investigating all of the sightings and began sort of compiling. I think he was one of the people who really began first compiling reports. Peter Byrne was, I think, an Anglo-Irish aristocrat who somehow got involved in it. It's probably a bit difficult looking at the picture in here when he's well into his 70s, but was sort of regarded as the playboy of it all. And somewhat later into the field, sort of more into sort of like the sort of like late 60s, early 70s, came Professor Grover Krantz, who was a professional physical anthropologist who particularly did a lot of work around the footprint studies and looking at things like dermal ridges and proving whether they were fake or not. All four of these fellas collaborated with each other at times. More often than not, they feuded with each other. because they had very, very different philosophies. They were both, all four of them would probably meant to be quite headstrong people, used to doing things their own ways. But from this point, it's actually quite interesting because something that came out at this point trickles down through Bigfoot study right through today. And what that comes to is this whole thing about Bigfoot is to kill or to not to kill. Now, René Desjardins and Peter Byrne very much have put on the philosophy that Bigfoot is some form of man and should not be killed under any circumstances. Grover Krantz and John Green very much see that Bigfoot is some type of ape, and that the only way to prove its existence is to get a body of some sort. I'll go on to the whole man-ape thing shortly. So what I did, I broke it down in terms of Bigfoot study, sort of like a number of different times of what happened. And I coined these phrases myself. You won't find them necessarily anywhere else anymore. But I've put like the theory of Bigfoot fever. So from 1967, when, there we go, what came known as Patsy, Bob Gimlin and Robert Patterson walked around a corner in Bluff Creek in Northern California and saw the Sasquatch down by the stream. I think she's washing her hands or something. She gets up and walks away. Now, various people over the years have tried to prove this is a fake, and whenever they've done it, I've never seen anything that actually looks like a bad man in a bad monkey suit, and yet people swear blind that because of that they've debunked it. I've yet to find any coherent debunking of that. I'm not saying it's definitely real. I personally believe it to be real, but I don't know for sure. But anyway, in terms of the Bigfoot fever, this was the whole thing that started it off. October the 10th, I think, 1967. No, October anyway, 1967. And from that point on, that would seem to be when all of the researchers were out, people were really hooked into it, and yeah, people were doing so. The woods began to be inundated. Bigfoot began to be entering into mainstream consciousness. The Yetis 20 years earlier, generally, but that was the situation there. We then move on to what we call the area of celebrity Bigfoot. And this is the more into like popular culture. So I've put 3 stills from 3 programs there. The top left-hand one here is from The Legend of Boggy Creek, 1972. It's a semi-documentary style of a series of Bigfoot-like encounters around a small town called Fuke in Arkansas, near the border with Texas and Oklahoma. Encounters still go on in that whole general area to this day. Here was, given how celebrity Bigfoot became at this point. I mean, when I was a small kid, $6 Million Man was one of the top TV shows that everybody watched. And forget about Doctor Who. Doctor Who never scared me. When I was at the age of about 7 or 8 and I saw Bigfoot on TV, I was absolutely terrified, and it really was. I think squeezing in between my mum and dad on the settee, being terrified. I mean, now I think I probably laugh my guts out if I bumped into that in the woods, but at the time it was hilarious. And the final one on the bottom, my own personal favourite, looking like a demented Ewok with a bad hair day, was a film called Snow Beast that was made in 1978, which directed essentially it was like this terrorising Bigfoot around this ski resort in Colorado. So this was this area of what I've called celebrity Bigfoot. There was other things there, the other series that people might be aware of that was called Fantasy Island. There was an episode of that where a guy wanted to shoot and bring back a Bigfoot, and in the end, I don't know, he found himself halfway down a cliff and was rescued by a tribe of Bigfoots. There's also lots of books come out at that time. I mean, some of them what became like seminal works in this Bigfoot study. I mean, I think one of John Green's one probably was Sasquatch, the Apes Among Us, which was a great big fat volume, 400 or 500 pages thick. And there was lots of other books that were coming out at times, some better than others. So that was that I think was the Bigfoot era. Then we've got like Bigfoot stagnation, so I put a nice pile of supposed Bigfoot poo there. And also at that time, around about 1981 I think, came out the Bigfoot Case book by 2 British authors, Janet and Colin Ward, But what they actually did there, they documented, they had a list in the glossary at the back of 1,000 different sightings. And that seemed to be, you know, there were other books that came out beyond 1980, but that seemed to be the last sort of big one. And then it always seems like into popular culture at the time, it was all like space and sci-fi. If you were different programs, it was like Dallas and Dynasty, you know, it was sort of like Bigfoot monsters, just like, you know, it's almost like, in some ways, the same as like westerns. It went out of favour, you know, monsters, westerns went out of favour, sci-fi, other stuff came back in. So that was, I see, like this Bigfoot stagnation period in terms of like the mainstream population. But in terms of that, you know, these researchers and the other people who spoke were still out there doing their things. John Green and the others were still collating all their reports, trying to make some sense of them. So it wasn't as if the study had died, it was just like, you know, out of the mainstream. And as a, you know, just going into secondary school, I was in 1980, at that point, there wasn't, you know, I couldn't find very few books beyond this. One of the ones I did come out at that point I thought was excellent, which didn't directly resort to Bigfoot, was Myra Shackley's book Wild Man, Yeti, Sasquatch and Neanderthal Enigma, which is one of the classic book, I think, from the 80s, in my opinion. So then I've put down about, you know, there's a whole thing about what I call that, you know, Bigfoot rebirth. And I've put down 2000 again, so it's a number I picked out from the ether, because it feels like a nice, rounded one to do. And I tied it in more or less with the rise of the internet and also the rise of technology. A lot of people that, you know, had like, you know, files and files and files of reports were able to put them into some coherent form in terms of, you know, sort of putting that data down on you know, programs and things like that. But you have the things like, you know, so you have organisations like the BFRO, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organisation, the GCBRO, the Gulf Coast Bigfoot Research Organisation. You know, these people developed websites, you know, as more people get the internet, they were able to report sightings and things like that. So things were becoming a lot more organised again. You know, and then a bit later on, there's been more programs. Most of it, in my opinion, of rather dubious quality. You know, I've got no real time for things like Monster Quest or Finding Bigfoot. I mean, it's like, you know, half an hour of like, you know, boom, 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 boom information, and then it's gone, and it's on to the next thing. But anyway, it's there, and it's sort of like generating a lot of interest from the you know, the general population. I think one of the things that comes in with that, so that is the Finding Bigfoot crew, for the people who don't know. Matt Moneymaker, I think, is the curator of the BFRO. Bobo's the tool guy that get to stand where a Bigfoot was seen and try and get a size comparison. But anyway, I think for me, it's one of the things that's like, you know, is people quite often say, you know, oh, isn't it great what the internet's done and things like this. I've actually come to the opinion now that the internet has actually created more problems in the whole era of Bigfoot research. For the simple fact, it allows any nutcase fantasist joker to get on board. And I think some of the stuff like really trying to separate the wheat from the chaff now is really, really difficult. And it's also, I think it's also created a lot of hatred in the study. So around this time, I've called that the winds of change. And for me, I can only look at this for me, about me. I started reading. I'm much more of a reader. I'm much more likely to buy books from out there or go to, you know, the Amazon website and get books from there than I am to look at stuff on the internet. But for me, the winds of change come through for 4 particular researchers. The first one's a guy called Tom Powell, who about 2001, I think, wrote a book called The Locals, and it was a contemporary investigation into the Sasquatch phenomena. And Tom Powell has a very, very interesting history as a person. He started off as a secondary school teacher, teaching Bigfoot as pseudoscience to his students. He then actually decided that in order to teach that fairly, he needed to actually understand what he was teaching. So he automatically taught it as something false. as he studied it more, he actually experienced that he found that actually he thought that there was more evidence to say that Bigfoot was actually a real living and breathing flesh and blood, something or other. He then went on to become a curator of the British Field Researchers Organisation at one time. But he actually found that as an organisation, he found that they were ignoring certain reports that were coming through to them that didn't fit their ideas of what they wanted Bigfoot to be. And he you know, I think partly being a science teacher was actually uncomfortable with this almost like this censorship. And so he's come from the, you know, like, you know, complete skeptic to complete believer, but has also tried in his book to actually marry up some of the more esoteric side of Bigfoot study with the more sort of like natural history side of it, and try to make some sort of coherent amalgamation of that. The other person was a lady called Mary Green. Now, Mary Green is she's a researcher. She's only based in Tennessee, so she's in both Tennessee's a big state, but one small part of one state. And Mary Green was the first person who brought to light to me the concept of habituation scenarios, and more of that later. The next person I have had most interaction with over the last couple of years is a woman called Autumn Williams. You'll be seeing her in a video clip shortly. Autumn Williams was a witness as a child, and without going into too much detail, but she set up the Oregon Bigfoot organisation and has continued to do some work with that. And finally, David Paulides has done a lot of work in around the States. One of the things he's done has been really, he's actually worked very, very closely with a forensic artist to actually put down drawings for when people give like their verbal descriptions of the Bigfoot. The forensic artist has actually drawn what they said. And the interesting thing is that this forensic artist has actually been, you know, is quite major and high up in his field in terms of, like, you know, quite a number of murder and rape cases have been solved on the basis of his forensic drawings. Also, David Paulides has also brought back, been very responsible for bringing back Native American perceptions of Bigfoot that have largely been ignored or just very much glossed over as a bit of, like, you know, ancient folklore. So habituation scenarios. They've been, like, the last 5-6 years, they've been quite key to Bigfoot research. Now, the definition I dug up on habituation was, my hypothesis is that Sasquatches will exploit human resources in specific contexts, in specific areas due to prolonged exposure to repeated and predictable human behaviours. These contexts are varied. Reports suggest that they occur most often at public use sites in heavily forested areas and at rural homesteads that are connected to food-producing agricultural lands. And that was Matt Pruitt that was his Sasquatch Field Research blog. So habituation scenarios are essentially ongoing encounters that an individual or a group of individuals will have with a Sasquatch individual or a group of Sasquatch individuals. Now, they vary as to what they are. But what I'm going to do now is play the film for about 10 minutes, and it's taken from a Bigfoot conference in Washington State in 2004 or 5, I think. And it is Autumn Williams, who I just referred to. She's talking, so it's essentially something else I'm bringing into the room to talk, but I think it's actually worth playing for about 10 minutes.
Habituation scenarios is about damn time. Oh, that was powerful. Incidental witnesses are hunters, hikers, campers, motorists. Okay? They have a brief and transient sighting. The eyewitness can report to you the height, the bulk, the hair color, the eye color, the gait. They have a very momentary, serendipitous encounter because they're in the right place at the right time, or depending on how freaked out they are, it's the wrong place at the wrong time. They're very different from long-term witnesses. Long-term witnesses claim ongoing encounters. They have limited interactions on a regular basis. They usually include sightings, odors, sounds, and gift exchanges. And these people have an opportunity to witness behavior of these creatures on an ongoing basis. So all things equal, when I was 16 years old, I was thinking, why is no one paying attention to these people? So at 16, I began researching, doing eyewitness interviews and field research. And I'm 31 now, so I've been doing this 15 years, half my life. And I started looking for these people, like my family, who had experienced these things. And I found what I found were families, and eventually, as I've crossed through the last 15 years, I found people all across the country, families, rural families, who are having these kind of things go on. When I began to find this when I was 16, I talked to other mainstream researchers about it, and they said, yeah, they're cuckoo. Here are some characteristics of long-term witnesses, and this is why they're seen as spooks. They live in rural areas. These people, and I hate to say it, but my family was one of these families. They lack the sophistication or the education necessary to make it in a big city. They're not the kind of people that you're going to find wearing a suit and driving to the IDS Tower in the middle of Minneapolis and living a day job. They're not those kind of people. But they're generally very wood-savvy people, salt-of-the-earth type of people. And they have a completely different perspective than some of you who may make it in a big city and take your RVs out. They're very, very in tune with their home environment. They live there. They know the sounds. They know what's going on. And when something odd starts happening, they take notice. These witnesses, interestingly, are usually women and children. The gentleman of the family will go off and he'll work a day job in a small town or a mill or something like that. And women and children are home. They have an affinity for animals. They keep livestock. They are very open-minded, and they tend to become, and here's where it gets sticky, they turn hyper-vigilant. Every noise, every tree branch, everything. This phenomenon is interrupting their everyday reality, their existence. For instance, there was a witness that my family actually knew. Everybody probably here has heard the Snohomish screams. Our neighbor was very good friends with that woman. She would sit on her porch at 2:30 in the morning every single night with this thing screaming its full head off a quarter-mile away in the gravel pit. And her little dog would sit behind her, beside her, shaking. And she would sit up there with a little Samuel recorder, recording this every night. Do you think she got any sleep? I mean, are these people crazy, or are they just sleep deprived? Who knows? They have a tendency to not want to share this information. They become very enamored of these creatures around their houses, and they don't want to share. They don't want people coming in with guns. They care very much about what's happening with these creatures, and they don't want anybody hurting them. Well, and here's another point. Many witnesses are many researchers are very particular about their witnesses. Bigfoot research is not a credible field by any stretch of the imagination. We are all kooks. So Bigfoot researchers attach a great importance. They want the ideal witness. They want a witness who is a member of the community, a pillar of the community, and who is highly educated and all of this. Well, here's a newsflash, folks. People who live in rural areas and have these encounters, that's not the way they are. But tough, because they're experiencing this anyways. Those are your witnesses, and those are the people that you want to be talking to. Those are the ideal situations for research. The other thing that researchers balk at, and I was talking about that excitability and that hypervigilance, is that witnesses have a tendency, these long-term witnesses have a tendency to interpret. Bigfoot banged on my house last night. Well, okay, tell me really what happened. Well, what happened? Well, we were sitting around about 11 o'clock, and we heard a big loud thud on the side of the house. Okay, well that's interpretation versus fact. The fact It's not necessarily attributable to Sasquatch. It is up to us as researchers to interpret the interpretations and get them down to fact so that we get a real clear skeptical view of what's going on. But that doesn't mean throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because if these people, I don't care if Lucy Sue down the road, who barely has any teeth, I don't care if she's a nut job or not. She very well may have a Bigfoot in her backyard. Are you just going to forget about her and not take up the chance of a lifetime because you don't like the fact that she doesn't have any teeth? In 1999, I began a correspondence with a woman, a long-term witness over the internet, and over the course of 2 years, it took 2 years for her to trust me and realize that I wasn't going to exploit her, and for me to trust her enough that I felt that it was worth the time and the money for me to travel all the way down to California and spend time with her. I was busy. I didn't want to, go on a wild goose chase. But I finally went down there, and my partner and I were taken out into the woods by her at midnight. There was another researcher, long-term veteran male researcher there, who wouldn't go, and he blamed it on the tick. So we went out in the woods, and it was she and I and my partner and his man. And we went out there at midnight and hiked 2 miles through the woods, and boy were there ticks, and we ended up going into a box canyon, and she had her feeding truck there. She takes, and I am not kidding you, an Oscar Mayer wiener whistle out of her pocket. Too much for credibility. She blows the whistle. I threw a little bit of fruit out, and we sat on this rock, and I said, "What?" And she said, "Sweet pea." And sure enough, about 5 minutes later, 2 great big people came walking up through the brush. They weren't even trying to be quiet. And I was shaking. And I said, she kept telling me, "Okay." And then a couple minutes later, she says, "Okay, we have to leave." And I said, "What?" She says, "We have to leave." And so I didn't question her. We just left. And we walked about halfway down the trail, about a mile down the trail. She lays a blanket down. She says, "Sit down." So we did. I said, "Now what?" She says, "We wait. They'll be here." 5 minutes later, 5 of them came. 5 distinct sets of heavy, crunching, loud, thudding footsteps. And the first one walked down in the dry creek bed and blocked our path out, proceeded to stomp, and broke a branch the size of my finger. They surrounded us in a star-shaped formation, and my partner actually saw the one, sorry Jason, walk between the trees on the hill to the left of us. Not to worry about it, that can make it work. And that creature subsequently came down, snuck down, he was being very quiet, he snuck down to within about 5 feet of me, behind a bush, and blew 3 puffs of stink into my face. And it smelled exactly like when my parents had the septic tank pump when I was a kid. It was awful. And it was amazing because eventually, sitting out there, I calmed down and all the fear went away, and I just realized this is amazing. This is just incredible. People say, "Why did you take a picture?" I had my Sony Night Shot camera sitting on my lap on infrared mode, pointed at the bush, and you know what I got a picture of? Infrared with leaves. And then she says to me, the most powerful thing of all, this is by the way, the box canyon that we were in. This is where we were sitting that night. And this is what she said to me. "We have to go now." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "We have to allow them to remain in control of the situation." And we left, and one of them, a sentinel, followed us out the whole way, whistling back to the other one. Tiny little subtle whistle, like at night. And that's the other thing that people don't realize, is that these things are subtle. They're very, very good at what they do. But so how often do you...
So that's a part of a DVD. So So that was just a basic about, sort of talking about what the habituation scenarios are and how they might actually work in certain situations. But I just want to go back to the thing about Jerry Crew in the beginning, not quite. It's back to what I said earlier about David Paulides, who is one of the few mainstream researchers recently, where Tom Powell has touched on it as well, who've actually gone back to looking at the Native American perception of Bigfoot. Now, the two figures on the screen up here. On the left, we have a figure known as Bukwas, who is the male form of Bigfoot. And on the right, we have the character known as Zonkwa. Now, Zonkwa, interesting enough, means cannibal woman. Now, a cannibal is not, we don't call a bear that eats human beings a cannibal. A person that we regard as a cannibal is another human being. So I think the perception there amongst Native Americans is that Bigfoot is another type of human being. There are, for as many tribes, First Nations people in America, North America and Canada, and even quite a lot of evidence right down through to Central and South America, there are as many names of this as there are tribes. And just to rattle off a few, there's Yalali for the Miwok, Umchegi for the Lakota, Yeye for the Apache, and Stoneclad for the Cherokee. So all of these are, so there's this ongoing history of a Native American tradition regarding these creatures. And too many, I think, of the past researchers looked at this as purely as folklore. They weren't going to Native American communities now, Native Americans did not all die at Wounded Knee. There are still, 4 or 5 million of them in North America and Canada. They are still there. And in 2006, I was lucky enough to spend 3 months working on the Cheyenne River Reservation in South Dakota. I was doing volunteer work down there. I've got a background of, I've spent most of my professional life, the last 20 years, working with children and young people. So rather than do a busman's holiday, I went out there to do exactly the same thing, but with a different culture. Now the two little girls up here, they don't look like angels, and they weren't, but they were nice kids. The little girl over here was called Ali Forebear, and the little girl on the right is called Misty Bad Warrior. I used to see both these girls most days. One day I was sitting in the library with a group of kids, there's a kids' library there, and Misty came up to me with, everybody familiar with those Where's Wally books? Of the books you open, there's little figures of Where's Wally and you have to try and locate them. And then she came up with that, and we were sitting there reading it, and there was one of the space station, and there was a picture of Chewbacca, or something like Chewbacca walking past, and that. And I just said to her, a cultural reference, I thought, does that look like Bigfoot there? And she goes, no, it doesn't look like Bigfoot. And she said this very, very matter-of-fact to me. No, it doesn't look like Bigfoot. She goes, Bigfoot wouldn't be there anyway. Bigfoot lives out in the countryside, and only comes into the towns to scare people that have been bad. So she fulfilled this, Bigfoot for her, from her cultural perspective, we could argue, fulfilled its very, very typical bogeyman sort of thing, something that, parents would use to scare their children. But the fact that it was so matter-of-fact and endemic to her culture at that point was one of the key things to me on here. Misty's family, you can generally, it's not set in stone, but generally, if the people, generally with the families that have traditional surnames will generally still have traditional beliefs and things. But these two little girls and their families lived in the major town on the reservation. The major town had a population of 3,000 people, in a place that was like, about the size of Kent, sort of thing. That's the size of it all. A couple of days after this, there was another little girl came in who I was working with, and she and her were doing a piece of artwork, much like the kids were in the back were over this last weekend. And I was just sitting there doing some stuff with some of these kids and that, and I just asked her, like you would do it. So you had a nice weekend, and she said, yeah. She said, we had a ceremony at the weekend, and she was like, she was sitting there, she was painting away, having a few sweets as she was doing, like kids would normally do. And she said, the spirits were all around, and then Bigfoot came up. And she said this in a very, very matter-of-fact way. So, I've been working with children and young people for over 20 years. I know when I'm being fed a line that's either designed to get my attention or she's looking for a joke or something. There was no sense of that from her. So from her sense, I mean, she did come from one of the very, very traditional communities, quite a bit further out onto the reservation. So there wasn't where she was living. She was probably brought up in a Lakota-speaking community, and so she had all of that. That would have been her background. So that was another very, very different side of it. While I was out there, I got to know an artist and his wife, a chap I call Harry, for want of a better word. And he asked me at one time, he just asked me just out of the blue, what did I think of Bigfoot? And I said, well, I think there's something in it, and I'm very, very interested in it, but I'm uncomfortable. I don't really know what to say what it is. Now, he said to me, two things he said. One thing he said was, Bigfoot's a shapeshifter. And he said, it could be in this room right now as a fly on the wall. He also said, Bigfoot came down from the stars with our ancestors, and if we ever need them again, they will fight alongside us. Now, I'm automatically my guards mount because I thought, oh my God, no, UFOs, here we go, sort of like, it's not something I feel comfortable with. But that was it. I mean, that was just it with the conversation. I asked him if he'd ever seen a Bigfoot, and he said, yeah, he saw one down by the creek bottoms one day when he was fishing, and he saw one moving in the woods beyond him. Again, it's always to illustrate about how matter-of-fact it is to people and how everyday. I also, at the youth centre, there was an older chap there called Romy, who was the sort of janitor, security, and he said to me one day, he said about his nephew who lived and worked on a farm further out on the reservation, had a disturbance one night, went outside, I don't think it was night time, it couldn't be night time actually, but he had his gun on him. He said he looked through his gun down the sights and he saw a Bigfoot moving away. And he said that his nephew wouldn't shoot because his nephew said it looked like some sort of man. But it also goes into, if you read a lot of the literature, a lot of Bigfoot sightings still happen on or near Native American reservations. And Tom Powell theorised that one of the reasons he thinks because of that is because culturally there's still a live and let live attitude amongst Native Americans towards like wildlife in general. It's just like, if we're going to kill you for food, we're going to kill you for food, but there's still a bit of a live and let live attitude there. So that was my experience on the Cheyenne River Reservation. I didn't see any Bigfoot myself, and I didn't go looking for them. Now, what has become probably the classic, in some ways the most controversial habituation scenario was the Tennessee case, and this, as I mentioned earlier, a woman called Mary Green, and she uncovered this scenario, I think sometime around like the mid to late 1990s, and she was in communication with this woman called Janice Carter Coy, and through her involvement with Janice Carter Coy, Mary Green identified this ongoing case that lasted 50 years with this family of Sasquatch on small rural property in Tennessee. Now, the book itself it's called that 50 Years with Bigfoot, and it starts with Janice's grandfather, who, when he's, by the sounds of it, sort of like a young man or a man of early middle age, he's chopping a tree one down his property, and he finds that what's come down with the tree looks to be some sort of like what he thinks initially is some sort of deformed, strange, wild, hairy child. He takes it into his house because it's subconscious. He looks after it, it wakes up, it goes berserk, starts breaking everything, and then sometime later the parents come and collect the child. Now, there seems to be a gap, because when Mary Green started her research into this case, the grandfather had died several years previously. So she never had time to talk to the grandfather about his experiences. So there's this quite a big gap. And so all that Janice could recall but her interaction started with the family when she was a little girl. And essentially it talks about what sounds like initially like a nuclear family. There's the male, the big male, who was the little one who was rescued, allegedly, was known as Fox. Grandfather used to refer to him as Fox, and this is apparently a from one of his stories was he would be cooking marshmallows and he showed Fox how to cook marshmallows over a fire. Fox had a wife or mate who was known as Sheba, and there was various children that came in, but also it talks about almost like a community of other Bigfoots that came and went, who may or may not have been related. So a sense of like a family that lived on that or near that residence, and others that came by and visited. Now, grandfather Carter apparently used to refer to the Bigfoot family as the Edomites, which, as far as I know, refers to something from the Bible. I don't exactly know what. I'm no biblical scholar. I suppose I could find out if I wanted to, but I never have one. But apparently he used to refer to them as Edomites. But I think like a good southern gentleman of his time and age group looked at looking at these creatures as something that he could relate to from the Bible, so from his cultural perspective. Again, I think it was around about 2004, 2005, the Russian hominologist Igor Bortsev went to visited the farm and was convinced that there was ongoing Bigfoot activity on the farm. Again, some people here will know of Igor Bortsev. I think he might have had some dealings with CSN at some point. And he was convinced that, this was a genuine case, as of some other mainstream Bigfoot researchers. I read the book, when I first read the book, I'm thinking, wow, because up until that point I was familiar with the old books. It was like, Bigfoot crossing a road, Bigfoot crossing a road. I was hunting, I saw Bigfoot, there's all that, so there's not much element to anything, so there's not much depth. Whereas this was the first one, so it was disturbing, I have to say that. It was disturbing to, I kept really thinking like, is this a lie? Have I just shelled out, I don't know, it was about 15 quid for the book or something, it don't matter if it wasn't actually, because it was an entertaining story. But probably for me the most disturbing thing was at the end there was a glossary of words. Now, Janice always talked about having a conversation. I've been talking to Fox and his family, her grandfather did. Now, the glossary at the back is by and large, 90% of that are words from Native American languages. Now, one thing she did know about her grandfather was that her grandfather had spent time when he was a young man working with Native American communities. So whether he tried a whole series of languages when he started talking to this Bigfoot family, and they managed to work out something, but there were some words that just to me just didn't really make any sense at all. One of the things that came out of this was that one time the researcher Mary Green and Janice Carter-Coy had made contact with another woman who was reporting encounters some miles away, 30, 40 miles away, I think. And Janice said that she would probably be able to speak to these creatures. Now, they went out to this remote location, and Janice shouted something into the woods into what Mary Green described as, to her, an unintelligible language, but was replied back from the forest. So it seemed as if there was some sort of dialogue going between Janice Carter-Coy and I think it was 3 creatures in the woods who remained outside while a conversation was going on. Mary Green said she didn't understand a word of what was going on, but it did sound like proper dialogue or conversation going on. I'm not too sure what the present situation is with it. I think it's ongoing, and I think Igor Bortsev may still have some involvement there, but it's certainly it's gone quiet for want of a better term. I imagine probably lots of researchers will be trying to find out where it was, and probably it went underground again. And this brings me to a question posed by Autumn Williams, the lady speaking in the clip. A couple of years ago on her Oregon Bigfoot website, she said, do we need to look at Bigfoot in terms of cryptozoology or social anthropology? If Bigfoot is or are a group of some form of hominids that are some ancient form of man or some form of ancient hybrid or something like that, then do we need to look at them from a social anthropological point of view rather than a cryptozoological point of view? To my mind, I'm sort of like, could be one or the other. If all these people are lying, if every witness over the years has lied about what they've seen, or they've all imagined something, or they've all hallucinated something. And I would say that yes, it probably is an area for social anthropology, because we need to understand why is there this need to lie, fabricate, imagine, or hallucinate. But anyway, from this picture here, I talked earlier about the forensic artist who worked with David Paulides, and these were some of the pictures he drew from some of the eyewitness accounts. Much more, I think, more human looking in terms of, in some of the pictures we used to see of ancient man, and some of those like Hamlin books of prehistoric man that I looked at when I was a kid. Very similar images to that, as opposed to the Gigantopithecus, the giant hairy ape, giant hairy orangutan stroke gorilla that Bigfoot is. So, and that also goes back to also about, why, where are we with this whole thing of like, is Bigfoot some sort of man or Bigfoot some sort of ape? What should we do with Bigfoot? It's like, where is it going to do, and to kill or not to kill? And sort of seeing where that goes from, and that sort of like leads us sort of nicely and even more controversially into the Dr. Melba Ketchum genetic study. Again, I suspect some people in this room will have heard and looked into this. Essentially, and this is the alleged story. I don't know. I neither believe nor disbelieve. There's just too much conjecture about it for me at the moment. But apparently, Dr. Ketchum, a geneticist, had sequenced Bigfoot DNA, and according to her findings, essentially she reckons 15,000 years ago, human beings interbred with a group of unknown male hominids. She thinks that human females with unknown male hominids mixed 15,000 years ago. So that would synchronise with the time the first Indians supposedly came into North America. But it also brings up a question about when did that mixing stop, and has it stopped? This is all, again, if it's actually true, when did that mixing stop? And as the artist who's had some work around here, Thomas Finley, said to me in a conversation a few months ago when this all first came out, he said that it still begs the question of who's the daddy. We don't know who the daddy is. Apparently it's said it's not Neanderthal, it's not the Denisova hominid, but nobody actually, there's no question about it, it's apparently an unknown somewhere on the human family tree. But it also might, if this is true, it also might account why some people still recording ape-like beings and some people are recording man-like beings, because presumably some people will look, the Bigfoot people will look more man-like, some will look more human-like, more ape-like. But there are case studies for this. I mean, there's been the quite famous one of Zana in the Caucasus, the sort of hominid who was captured and had several babies by human fathers. There's a case I've read a few times online of in Australia of a woman around about the early 1900s who was raped by a Yowie, the Australian equivalent, had a baby that was then kept in a shed and then it escaped. It's all quite, there's all these stories, and that could all be like rubbish, but there are some, and there are some ongoing hints, I suppose, that Bigfoot is still, there are still occasional kidnappings, and it certainly fits in again with Native American beliefs about that. Unfortunately, whether this is true or not, it all got rather ugly online, in that it just got very, very nasty, and I think this is an ongoing problem in the whole era and the whole area of Bigfoot study, is that people get very, very nasty. They have a point of view, and anybody who disagrees with their point of view, they can actually get, it gets bloody to the point that even as me sitting in my armchair in England, I removed myself from most of the Facebook Bigfoot pages I was members of, because I was just sick and tired of just reading all this hatred directed at for no particular reason. I mean, it just seemed just absolute nonsense. And again, there's all this stuff that seems to be tied into it with ego, reputation, and money as well. Money is the key one. I mean, I think there's one thing there's a big Bigfoot industry in TV programs now that people almost don't want that disturbed. There was a mixture in terms of the mainstream science response. I mean, to be honest, I actually wish she never released the things she did, because I think even if it had been absolutely perfect and flawless, she wasn't going to get a sound hearing from mainstream science. And then, so following from this was on the slide before, is the thing about Bigfoot language and, does it have a coherent language? Again, getting to 1972, these two guys here, Ron Moore and Scott Nelson, run in the Sierras of California, and apparently recorded these sounds of Bigfoot's interacting and vocalising. And this seems to be one of the new, along with habituation scenarios, a new area, yet another new area of Bigfoot research where people are actually sort of investigating that and actually, is it kind of, the preliminary evidence seems to think that from this is that these sounds are spontaneous, they don't seem to have been made up. But the way it's going now, for every debunking story, there's this is a fake story, blah 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 blah. So again, I don't really know, but are we able to play that chat? Is that so? There is this about a minute and a half long clip of the samurai chatter.
I think it's just
I think some sounds really come through. Yeah, I don't think it's working, is it? Yeah, it might not, anyway, that was what it was known as the samurai chatter. So the best way I can describe it, I don't have Richard's vocabulary, but it does sound a bit like somebody talking in very, very harsh Japanese, very, very quickly. So it was like, and they've coined it as the samurai chatter because of that. And this is just one type of, and there are seem to be ongoing sort of like efforts to try and break it down and see if they can. And there does seem to be some headway being made, but again, it ties back to this whole problem with the internet. How much of this is just made up? Who knows? But so that was the whole thing about the speech, which again lends into this whole thing. Is it a branch of social anthropology or cryptozoology we should be looking at?
Sorry, I want to just trying to find the clip online. we have a meeting with them, just have people speak.
So they won't go to the next slide.
Oh. That's what language. Oh, okay, not that one. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
That's okay. So, anyway, that's my bad impression of what it sort of sounds like. But then, what does the future hold? Now, I first I adapted this presentation from one I did about a year ago. There is a general feeling in the Bigfoot community that the truth will soon out. Personally, I don't think it will. I'm quite sure that if I live to 90, for whatever reason, I just don't think, whatever the truth is, it will, if we keep going down the same research methods. What will, if Bigfoot is discovered, what will it mean for science and humanity and Bigfoot? I think some of the people who are saying the whole thing about we need to prove Bigfoot's existence so we can protect it doesn't really stand up as an argument. It seems to be, they seem to be doing all right without us. What will it mean for humanity? I think there are some people who are worried that it will, like, you know, threaten things to do with, like, you know, the Bible or Islam and those sort of religious beliefs about everything. I don't know, I can't see that it could be anything other than a bonus for science, but who knows. But this last point comes out of a conversation I've had with admittedly only two very brief conversations, with two physicists. And both of them had said that they felt that perhaps in the area of Bigfoot study, that physics would be a better way of understanding the phenomenon, at least initially, than biology, because they certainly felt that there was some sort of like the physics was perhaps more open-minded about the very, very nature of the universe, and actually if we get a broader understanding of the nature of the universe, it might make us have a better understanding about the nature of Bigfoot. And that's not me, that's not because I believe again that they're coming down from UFOs or anything like that, but more to do with the fact that actually it just feels like particularly biological sciences tend to be just very, very blinkered about this. Another conference a couple of months ago, Richard Freeman was out and talked, and he said that some people weren't interested in taking his studies about the orangutan seriously because they just said it was too big a mammal for them to worry about. It's just that if people are up against that, then I think it's going to be a problem. So in terms of, I've just put these down last books and that I think that are worth anybody reading that are interested enough. The Hooper Project is the first book by David Paulides. Very good. It's all done on a reservation in Northern California, talking to people up there. That was the Tom Powell book that really got me into like the first thing that it really got the whole thing about Bigfoot crossing the road, and broke out of that scenario. Enoch was a book edited by Alton Williams, the guy, the long-term witness that she was in dialogue with, who related his stories with a male Bigfoot that he developed a friendship with in Florida. All these are allegedly, I don't know any of these, I can't say these are all truths or lies, this is just what I've read and what it is. That was the 50 years of Bigfoot. That's quite hard to get hold of, but worth it. As I said, if it was all over rubbish, then it's still worth it. It's a cracking good read. This book is really good. It's a small book, Impossible Physics, by a bloke called Christopher Noel. And he relates about 6 different habituation scenarios of various parts of the US. And again, I think he's still doing quite a lot of stuff in that, ranging from places like he's in, you know, up in sort of like Maine, I think it's down in Oklahoma. He was also early doing stuff out in like the traditional Bigfoot country out in the Pacific Northwest. So there I am really. Thank you for listening, and any questions?
Okay, have I got... Where's Joe? There you are, Jojo. You were hiding. I didn't see you. Okay, questions. Who have we got? Start off, Joe, with Sean at the front row. Just wanted to ask if you're aware, around about I think Christmas or just before Christmas, there was reports coming out about Bigfoot that have been caught and captured in California, and it all seems rather interesting and plausible, and then all sort of kind of descended into farce. Have you any information on that?
No, I took a personal standpoint with the internet, mainly because I think I'd be getting so excited about something only to be let down. Is that, and I'm pretty much a Luddite in most of it, until it comes out in a book that I can digest and look at it that way. So I think if there's any validity to it, then people will generally put it in books, actually. I think too many, it's just, I'm not saying that a lot of stuff that is on the internet is a load of old rubbish, but it just seems to me, as soon as it goes on there, there's claims and counterclaims, and I've got better things to do with my time. You know, sometimes I think, you know, it's more important to me to make a corned beef sandwich. I don't really want to read about all these arguments. But yeah, I mean, that was one. I mean, I think before that there was a Bigfoot in a fridge in Georgia or something like that.
This was supposed to be like a live Bigfoot that they captured. It was one of the main Bigfoot groups that were behind it. And,
right.
And it was also, yeah, they were going to announce everything. But yeah, then it just sort of, it all seemed really interesting, and then suddenly people started attacking it, and then it just fell into farce.
That's just what seems to happen. It just seems to just keep going that way.
I found, if you're too interested, I found a clip.
So that's just a brief clip of the sounds thing. So yeah, thanks, Doug.
Hi. You were saying earlier that there's maybe a connection with the ape and it may be man-like. Would it be possible it could be a forgotten civilization of man? Like when they keep finding a new version of caveman in science, would that be possible?
I suppose if it's a possibility, but it's hard to say really. I think, rightly or wrongly, I sort of get the impression that it might not be exactly the right way of doing it, but perhaps Melba Ketchum is on the right thread, that there's some sort of relationship with human beings. And again, it's the whole thing, if we look into Native American theories about what Bigfoot are, and then trying to, you know, separate the fact from folklore in that. It's actually, you know, it's not, don't just throw, it's that whole thing about not throwing the folklore away to find out, you know, well, what can we extract from that folklore to what is the real stuff. I think there's probably something, but I don't think, you know, I don't put it down to some like lost civilization of Lemuria or, you know, they're giant Neanderthals or anything like that. Personally, they might be. I'd be quite happy to be proved wrong on any of those. I just don't think that they are personally.
I was part of the Extreme Expeditions team last September, and one of the things that was mentioned a lot by people was the issue of the logging, especially, I mean, the issue with Oregon when they found the owl. They literally lost, you know, millions to the economy, and people were starving in some of the areas from what I heard. And that came up a lot, really, and I think there's a real incentive not to find it. I don't think there's any particular, it probably protects it with the logging, to be quite frank. With an owl it'd be different, the nests, but I think that was a big thing that seemed to come up a lot, that people, and I mean I think with the Christianity as well, it would throw a lot of people's views on things. But a lot of people, we spoke to some people who reckon they'd seen it, and some people, especially one woman who said in Idaho, her uncle used to own a lake and a mountain, was actually stood there, and a mother and a young sort of, he saw the young and then the mother and the sort of young swam across the lake in front of him. And, you know, and what everybody said, or the accounting the relatives had said, was you're just absolutely terrified. These things are really large, and I think it's a account why a lot of people don't get shots. Because, you know, a lot of people said you just want to get out of the way. These things are really, really large. And I think, as I said before, the big thing is people are using camcorders with automatic focus, and they can't cope with the trees. They're trying to focus on different objects. So it's really important, I think, if people are going to get into trying to take a shot, they do take a manual focus camera in with them. So I think that's actually stopped us getting a lot of good shots. But, yeah.
Hello. I was just wondering about that Milberg Ketchum lady. It sounds like a Pokemon trainer and looked insanely bizarre. You said she had DNA sequence, but it all kind of went wrong and the internet kind of blew up. What actually did she have? I mean, was there any scientific evidence?
I think the total was she had 106 different samples, and what she said was, I think it said it was a mixture of hair samples, soft tissue samples. There might have been some presumed dung as well. I'm not sure, but essentially a range of samples. And apparently these 106 all confirmed the same theories about, you know, that they all come from I don't know. Well, the whole thing that paper needs is somebody who has a background in genetics or something to do with genetics to translate it into layperson's terms. I mean, I again forked out my 20 quid to get, you know, my copy of it, but I read it and I just thought, like, well, it probably is really good stuff here, even if it's a load of lies in the worst case scenario, or a load of errors. But for a layperson like me, I couldn't really translate what it was other than the basics.
Because I do wish you got like 100-something samples of the same DNA.
Yeah.
When she's a geneticist, she said that DNA was what kind of humanish and
the mixture was between, so apparently it sequenced between 15,000 years ago, human females and males of an unknown hominid species, so interbred. So, which again, it also brings up the questions of who's the daddy. So to the best...
Can you do that with DNA? Can you be that specific about the time things happened? And
I haven't a clue. As I said, I don't know. I mean, it's just the thing. I haven't got a clue. I mean, it needs somebody with... Well, it needs, to my mind, what it needs is somebody who's genuinely impartial, and really genuinely impartial to look at it.
A scientist, maybe.
Well, I'm not too sure. I'm not no longer convinced. You know, mainstream science is impartial.
If you have DNA, though, surely there must be places you can send DNA, which, you know, if you actually have tons of samples of DNA.
But I think that there's enough evidence with other things, with DNA and other things, where I know of a story I was relating in the last couple of months with, related to big cats, where stuff went to one place and came back as leopard, and another place came back and said, no, it's dog. And apparently, you know, and there does seem to be some sort of like, you know, some other sort of involvement there. I think it does not want stuff to come out as being related to cats for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And the whole point is that something, you know, the plan is to send somebody something that is bona fide leopard poo from a zoo and see if it still comes back. They're still going to come back and say it's dog or something. It's like just to see what it is to try and catch them. So that's the whole thing.
Machiavellian.
Yeah, and I have no. That's the whole thing. I don't really have any faith because it seems. To be perfectly blunt, it's too much male ego. I mean, when it comes to primatology in general, it seems by and large it's the women who've actually done in recognised primatology. You've got Baruti Guldikas, Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey on the chimpanzee gorilla.
They were the tools of one man, though, weren't they? I mean, there was all
They
sorts
were,
of the same
but
professor.
you've got Debbie Marta, who's been in Sumatra now for goodness knows how many years. We had, you know, Jean-Marie Kaufmann in the Caucasus, who's been there for about 500 years or something.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't think it's that's.
Wasn't Diane Fossey and Jane Gould and Baruti, the professor who sent them out, thought that women would get on better with primates and be less aggressive to them and kind of be able to bond socially because women are better socially.
Yes.
It's an old bigot, really, isn't it?
So there's also there's loads of different things to do. I think with that really. I mean, it's like. I think, as I said, until someone can genuinely look at it without fear of their own reputation being called into question and their own funding that they might get, I mean, Grover Krantz, who spent years and years involved in Bigfoot research, said he's quoted on record as saying, my institution support my Bigfoot research by not firing me. He was stopped from getting lots and lots of promotion, and he thought it was purely because of that. So I think until the Bigfoot study loses its, and I'm not sure that's the thing, I'm not too sure it ever will lose its contentious element, that I'm not too sure we will do. I think Orang Pendek is very, very different because we're looking at something 3 to 5 foot in jungles where apes are known to exist, not in North America. So I think it's a very, very different sort of scenario there.
Thanks a lot.
Darren or Max, would you like to comment? I think this is going to have to be the last one, but we've naturally overrun.
It's okay. Hi, I'm a tame and very friendly geneticist, and I've checked out some of Melba Ketchum's sequences, and the ones that I checked out came back as mice. Other people have checked them and they've come back as every single small North American mammal you can find. I mean, if I have a laptop, I can show you how to do that. You can do that yourself. You can look at the sequences, go on the internet, use the free software that's on the internet, and you can check that out yourself. If you want to do that, you can do that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm neither swayed one way nor the other with genetic study. I'm not. It's almost like immaterial to me about whether the genetic study proves nothing. I was convinced it wasn't going to prove. That's the only thing I wasn't going to prove anything. I'm still to this day, unfortunately, don't think anything would ever prove it until a body comes to light. I'm convinced of that. But from what I've read, I'm very, very doubtful the body will ever come to light in my lifetime. For all sorts of reasons, I think that's not because I don't think it exists, but I just can't see it, to be perfectly honest.
Sure. I mean, I'm fairly sceptical towards the existence of Bigfoot as whatever, or whatever you want to explain it as. But people using the Melba Ketchum study as a golden shining light of how Bigfootology should be. It's dumb, whatever you want to call it, and it's awful.
Yeah.
I'm quite happy to go on record and say that. The paper is just gibberish. It's in science. Science is so heavily sort of controlled, and there are very basic things that you do, including using correct grammar and spellings. Obviously some slip through that. Everyone's human. but the sheer number in that paper is just is worrying, to be brutally honest. And a lot of their what are called phylogenies, evolutionary trees, if you will, completely contradict hundreds of studies on primate DNA saying that this is an evolutionary tree. I think there's one paper just going off the top of my head that groups lemurs as more closely related to humans than humans are to gorillas.
Right, okay.
Which is just nonsense. Complete nonsense. Which suggests that there is something seriously, stunningly wrong in her ideas of that. I don't think she's out deliberately to hoax anybody. I think she's just very, very naive. Yeah, I think that's good.
One of the other references turned out to be from the online April Fool's joke.
Yeah. They referenced at least 2 or 3 April Fool's joke papers as being serious.
James, it was the most. I feel very sorry for you. You spent 20 quid on it. I stole mine. I feel very proud of that. It's terrible. Jojo, can I have the microphone back? Sorry to have to draw it to a close. At the beginning of the talk, I said we're going to have extra time for lunch because we had plenty of time, and you guys have been talking all through the extra time. So in order to keep it back on some sort of track, how am I supposed to start there?
You switched it off, didn't you, dear? So in order to try and keep on some sort of schedule, I'm afraid we're going to have to draw it to a close. But thanks for coming, James. I am impressed with what you guys do with the London Cryptozoology Club, and if there's anything we can do to help you in the future, then please, you only have to ask. Ladies and gentlemen, James Newton.